December 1952, one of the deadliest peacetime tragedies in history struck London. Over 4 days, a stinking yellow smog smothered the city so dense people couldn't see their hands in front of their faces. The capital ground to a halt. But far worse, the smog was loaded with poisonous gases, and there would be devastating consequences.
I'm Dr. Zand van Tulleken, and over 2 programs we'll be telling the story of how this catastrophe unfolded moment by moment, taking the capital by surprise and leaving tragedy in its wake.
The city fell silent. Thousands became sick, hospitals were at breaking point, and the government attempted to hide their failings. And now, for the first time on television, we'll reveal the full extent of this 4-day deadly emergency.
At the time, the official death toll was 4,000. But, as we discover, the real figure was much, much greater.
In this program, I trace the first 2 days of the Great Smog, discovering how it began to take a deadly stranglehold on the city.
I really didn't think he was going to last the night.
And investigate why Churchill's ministers didn't act.
It was seen by the government as the price that Britain had to pay.
And Raksha Dave will experience the smog firsthand.
Just this awful toxic smell.
This is the story of the great killer smog.
In early December 1952, London had been enjoying idyllic winter weather. The cloudless sky, a clear, dazzling blue. A new young queen was in Buckingham Palace, and war hero Winston Churchill was back in number 10. There was finally an air of post-war optimism in the capital. But on the 4th of December, everything began to change.
That Thursday morning, people were disappointed to wake up to a typically dull, miserable British December day. The air was damp and chilly, and the clouds hung low over the city. No one suspected that within a day, a killer fog would bring tragedy to the streets of London. It was by far the worst disaster that Britain would face since the Blitz.
After a cold morning, temperatures fell even further that afternoon to below freezing. The wind dropped, the air became completely still. Not that this deterred Londoners. At Earl's Court, preparations began for the thousands of farm animals due to arrive from across Britain to compete in the famous Smithfield Show. And Prince Philip was attending an ice hockey match at Wembley Park. There was no hint any extreme weather was on the way.
As the sun set that Thursday over London, patches of fog began to form at the lowest part of the Thames Valley, here by the river.
Over the course of the evening, it gradually built, spreading 92 miles up and down the river, from Teddington in the west to Gravesend in the east.
But this fog was far from normal. Freak weather conditions meant there was something about it that would soon become lethal. And Raksha's gone to find out what that was.
I've come to the Met Office HQ in Exeter.
I want to discover what they can tell us about the deadly weather conditions that London was about to suffer.
Archivist Catherine Ross
Oh, wow. Okay.
is helping me find the original weather records from the time.
Very impressive.
So what we're going to have a look at here is a pressure chart for the UK for the 4th of December 1952.
I do love a map.
And I actually do recognise some of these squiggly lines. They're the same lines that you get on the weather forecast.
You're absolutely right. So these are isobars. So what they're basically telling us is that here we've got the centre of a very big area of high pressure that's just starting to drift in across the UK.
So this high pressure is moving towards London?
Yeah, absolutely. Here at 10 o'clock on the 4th, so just a few hours later, the area of high pressure is sitting right over London.
What kind of weather would that create?
Well, if we have a look at this book, which is for the Met Office headquarters at Victory House, pretty much in the centre of London, if we move through to the 5th, by this point the high pressure's sitting smack over London, and as you can see, no wind at all, it's dropped to calm.
So is it this high pressure that will create this unusually thick fog?
Yes, so one leads to the other. So normally, warm air rises, heads up into the atmosphere, gets cooler. You think about flying at 10,000 feet, it's really cold up there. But in a high pressure, you get a layer of warm air at the top, trapping cooler air underneath. And so that means whatever's down there can't move because it can't rise up through the warm air.
So what you're saying is that it essentially creates this invisible lid that seals all of London?
Yeah, and it's not going to go anywhere at all until the wind rises.
On the Thursday evening, Londoners sat at home wouldn't have noticed anything out of the ordinary. But down on the Thames, the fog was starting to cause problems. The first consequences of that invisible lid above London. In 1952, East London was home to one of the biggest ports in the world, the docks handling over a third of all Britain's imports. Tens of thousands of ships arrived each year, bringing the food and materials essential to keep the capital running.
But by midnight, the fog by the River Thames had grown so thick that visibility here had fallen to zero. The Port of London Authority was forced to close the River Thames to all shipping. London's crucial supply route was at a complete standstill.
In the early hours of Friday, the 5th of December, as most of London slept, the fog began to spill out from the Thames and gradually spread through the streets of the city. As dawn approached, fog blanketed London for 20 miles in all directions, covering over 1,500 square miles. In 1952, 8.5 million people lived in Greater London, only about 1 million fewer than today. 98% of them still lived in houses with coal fires. So on that morning, millions of fires were lit, the smoke pumping into the city's stagnant, foggy air.
I lived in a block of police flats, and there were 60 flats in this block. You could imagine 60 coal fires all burning in one spot. London was obviously known as the Smoke, wasn't it? It was nicknamed the Smoke because it always smelt.
I was a school teacher at the time. I was 21 and the house I lived in was big and was heated by coal. There were about 11 fireplaces, so you would be burning a lot of coal. And we did burn a lot of coal.
Something rather unusual was about to happen to the tons of sulphurous smoke pouring out of chimney stacks across the capital that morning. As that polluted smoke mixed with the fog, it turned from harmless white to a greasy, thick, yellow, toxic smog. And London was completely unprepared for what was about to happen.
On the 5th of December 1952, Londoners woke up to find the city blanketed in fog. It was close to freezing, so millions of coal fires had been lit across the capital. Commuters noticed that the fog was starting to turn yellowy green, and the muffled sound of coughing began to echo in the streets.
On that Friday morning, it was really quite alarming because the smog by then was thick. And so you hung on to the railings of the houses you were passing.
Waking up in the morning, it was sort of, well, there wasn't any outside at all. It just came in and it just settled. And it got worse and worse and worse. We just carried on going to school and you couldn't see. And because the fog muffled the sound, even if there was a car coming, you couldn't hear it. So it's very, very dangerous.
Now, the fog was thickest down here by the River Thames, and normally on a day like today you can see for miles up and down the river. But on that first day of the smog, you'd have been lucky to catch even a glimpse of the then coal-fired Battersea power station right there across the river. If you had seen it, you would have seen those iconic chimneys pouring out vast plumes of coal smoke into the air.
In 1952, there were 9 coal-fired power stations in London, guzzling over half of all the coal burned in the city.
Now, normally the pollution-filled smoke belching out of those chimneys would rise even higher into the sky and immediately be blown away and dispersed by the wind. But that morning, people noticed that the smoke from those tall chimneys was not rising upwards. Instead, it was heading downwards towards the ground.
The smoke was being trapped by the lid of high pressure above the city.
Smoke combined with fog gives you smog, and this was extremely familiar to Londoners. They had lots of nicknames for it: a black fog, a London particular, or the most evocative of all, pea super. Yellowy green and thick.
I remember it made my throat burn. Eyes were constantly streaming. Choking sensation, you couldn't breathe deeply or and horrible taste in your mouth.
The whole thing was like a blanket which kind of smothers you. It's a sort of feeling that you're all on your own, you're disembodied. This is what I remember most of all, but it was the smell. A smell like sulphur, rotten eggs. Awful, just awful.
Now, that morning, as more and more smoke and pollution entered London's air, the fog became increasingly dirty, smelly and toxic. Now, luckily, we don't get pea super fogs anymore in Britain. So to understand what Londoners were really suffering that day, I've sent Raksha to go and recreate her own pea super so she can experience what it's like firsthand.
Great to see you. You all right?
To make Smog, I've recruited the help of special effects expert Mike Sansom.
So we've sealed the workshop. We need to get the humidity up. So best way to do it, we start boiling things.
Mike is replicating the damp air of London in December '52.
So what's the next step then? Because we've created mist.
So now we need to cool the temperature down because, of course, cold air can't hold as much water vapour in it as warm air.
So how are we going to do that?
Well, liquid nitrogen, of course.
Of course.
So liquid nitrogen is at minus 196 degrees.
OK. Do I need to stand back?
If you stand behind me, you'll be fine.
Says the mad professor. OK. Oh, gosh, wow.
See all of that creating straight away.
Straight away.
Again, we're replicating what happened in London. Fog formed as the temperature dropped.
But now we need to create smog, and how do we do that?
Right, we're going to burn some coal.
What, in here?
Yep, right here, come on. You can really see it, can't you? You can see the smoke mixing with the moist air, and that's creating our smog.
It's just lingering and just hovering under the ceiling.
So back in the day, it was really poor quality coal that they had. So it was really sulphurous. So I'm going to add some sulphur to this so you'll really get to experience what it was like. And you'll see a blue flame appearing. And you don't want to get close, but you can instantly smell the egginess of that.
Oh.
It's getting quite bad, isn't it? So let's put respirators on now.
That's vaguely better.
OK, so now we can go full 1950s smog. So I'm going to turn this up to 11.
It's astonishing that the whole of London was like this in 1952. It's absolutely scary. And people used to say that they couldn't even see their own hand in front of their face, and I can't. I really can't see my feet. I'm just going to take this off for a minute.
It's just this awful toxic smell. Smoke and sulphur and fumes. And I can just feel it at the back of my throat. I'm going to put this back on. This is awful.
Mike?
I am still here.
Oh, you are still here. Are you quite? You sound as though you're really close by, but I can't see you. Hey! Which way is the way out?
On that way there. Right, over this way.
Oh.
Oh. Well, that was probably worse than any fog I've ever experienced before in my life.
It's really bad, yeah.
I mean, normal fog, it's a bit of a nuisance. It causes traffic jams and trains to be cancelled. But that smog, that was like on another level. I knew that you could get me out of there. But in 1952, the whole of London was covered with that. There was no escape.
In London, as more smoke was pumped out into the damp, stagnant air, the smog grew ever thicker. At midday, the streetlights had to be turned on, and many people were only now arriving at work, having got lost on their familiar commute.
Here at Paddington Station, special trains were arriving, 50 cars each, containing hundreds of sheep and cattle for the Smithfield show. And of course, the smoke from the steam engines adding to the already polluted air.
Farmers from across Britain had sent their finest animals to the show, hoping to be judged supreme champion. The trains had to crawl through foggy London at walking speed. At Paddington, the animals were loaded onto lorries to be driven to Earl's Court.
Now, Earl's Court's about 3 miles that way. The journey should have taken about 15 minutes. Instead, the lorries got lost in the dense smog and caught in the thick traffic that was building up across the city. The journey took several hours in the end, and it was the first sign of the travel chaos that was to engulf London.
And the effects of the smog were now being felt inside people's homes. They noticed their white clothes had turned grey in the sooty air. Their faces and hands became covered in a black grime. Surfaces became coated with a grey-black, greasy film of dirt. Even inside, there was a yellow haze.
The smog almost had a life of its own because it could creep through windows and it crept through doors. You tried to block the windows up with tape or cushions or anything to keep it up, but you just couldn't do it. Every time somebody came into the house, there was another inrush of more smog.
And already, on that first afternoon of the Great Smog, people were suffering breathing difficulties. Almost all had pre-existing illnesses such as bronchitis or asthma. District nurses were dealing with twice as many respiratory cases as normal, and calls for ambulances had increased by a third.
My father was 46 years old at that time, and he had bronchitis, so he always coughed a lot. He did smoke, not heavily. He was a manager of the House of Commons tea room. Parliament in those days used to break up in the afternoon, so he had the afternoon off for 3 hours, but had to go back in the evening. So he travelled on the tube, so he would have had quite a lot of smog to cope with, which didn't do his chest any good at all.
But the people who fell ill that afternoon, those with respiratory illness, often fell ill during the winter, particularly when it was cold, damp and foggy.
It was 16 hours after the smog descended that the first evidence emerged revealing how unusually dangerous it was.
Over there is the old City Hall building. In 1952, that was home to the Greater London Council. But that building was also home to a pollution testing station.
The machine measured the amount of coal smoke in the air and the levels of the noxious gas, sulfur dioxide, that was produced when coal was burned.
At exactly 4:30 p.m, a scientist would take a reading to figure out how much pollution had been in the air that day. And the results that Friday were shocking.
The amount of coal smoke in London's air was 5 times higher than a normal, already smoky December day. And the amount of poisonous sulfur dioxide had also increased 500% in just 24 hours. Londoners now heading home from work felt the impact of that soaring pollution. They'd struggled in the daylight that morning. Their journey back would be in darkness. For some, it would prove fatal. At the end of the first day of the Great Smog, thousands of Londoners were attempting to get home from work in the dark. To discover what the commuters faced that night, I'm going on a bus trip with Mike Kay, who worked for many years as a conductor.
Trying to get to 1952.
Good morning, Zen. Welcome aboard, young man.
Look, I've always wanted to have a go on one of
I want
these.
you to wear one of those.
Oh, this is great.
That's it, keep turning.
Oh, look at that!
There you go, you've issued a ticket all on your own.
A ticket? Am I right, this bus actually operated during the Great Smog?
Absolutely.
So that Friday night, people have been at work all day, they start to go home, darkness comes. What is happening to transport in London?
Well, transport is gradually coming to a halt. I mean, you just couldn't see in front of you. That was a problem. Even for the underground, there was something like 3,000 people queuing up at Stratford Station.
And how are they doing any navigating at all? Like, are the buses moving at walking pace?
Well, on the first night, transport companies started issuing these flares, as you can see, being dipped in oil or something, like a rope on the top. They lit that, and then either the conductor or the passengers on board would take turns in walking in front. I saw many buses with policemen in front.
I mean, you've really stopped being a passenger at the point where you're leading the bus with a flare.
That's right. And many times I saw when someone had done that and they came back on the bus and swapped over, everyone would clap and then, I mean,
They still pay for their ticket?
Of course they still pay for it.
So, paint a picture for me of what's going on with the commuters.
All over the roads, people are just abandoning their cars, just leaving them in the side of the road. It's reduced the width of the road, so therefore it's more dangerous to drive. It's already dangerous to drive because you can't see in front of you. And it was really desperate.
And latterly, were the buses getting abandoned as well?
Yes, they came to a situation where the crews simply couldn't risk continuing any further. And they literally had to leave the buses, and the instruction was from London Transport to leave them in a safe place.
So we're just at the end of the first day of the smog, and despite the heroic efforts of everyone in London Transport, the entire network is in disarray.
The entire network is coming to a standstill.
It's a total nightmare for everyone.
Absolutely. And the bottom line was that the majority of the commuters that first night had to finish up walking home.
Thousands of commuters were struggling home on foot through the thick, choking fog. Streetlights would have been a dim yellow glow in the gloom, and in fact, people couldn't even make out the names of streets on buildings. They became hopelessly lost and disoriented, even on familiar routes.
After walking for hours through the smog, workers arrived home with their throats and lungs burning. Coughing, they brought up glutinous, black phlegm.
As the daylight went, it obviously got worse. And that's when it became really murderous.
My father went to work on the Friday, I think, as normal, and I think it must have been that evening, and he started to wheeze a bit, but he was still eating, so he weren't too worried. Well, he'd always coughed all his life, so I didn't sort of take too much bother with it.
The same evening, the BBC put out an appeal for off-duty ambulance drivers to return to work because so many emergency calls were being received. But there was no mention that the smog may be dangerous, and no warnings were issued by the government.
It's easy to see how in 1952, dirty smog was just part of everyday life in the city. Everyone who lived in London, including the 78-year-old Winston Churchill, had experienced multiple smogs. Why should this one be any different?
I want to find out quite how long smog had been a problem in London. I've come to the archives of University College London to see a 360-year-old pamphlet written by John Evelyn.
Evelyn published this in 1661. That's a time when Londoners were suffering pretty regularly with outbreaks of smallpox, tuberculosis, even the plague. But Evelyn would have argued that smoke pollution rivaled any of those, and that's what led him to publish Fumifugium, or The Inconvenience of the Air and Smoke of London. Have a look at what he has to say. That hellish and dismal cloud of sea coal, which is not only perpetually imminent over her head, but so universally mixed with the otherwise wholesome and excellent air that her inhabitants, he's talking about London, breathe nothing but an impure and thick mist, corrupting the lungs and disordering the entire habits of their body. Catarrhs, coughs, and consumptions rage more in this one city than in the whole earth besides. Clearly, London has a long history of smog, but nothing was done about it then, and not much was done about it before the Great Smog. It was seen by the government as the price that Britain had to pay for its industrial wealth. Where there's muck, there's brass, as they say.
On the Friday evening, Commonwealth commissioners threw a black-tie bash for dignitaries and politicians at the Guildhall. They were disturbed by seeing smog seeping into the Great Hall. But this was nothing compared to the tragedy unfolding in homes around London, predominantly in poorer areas.
Although they'd only endured one day of the smog, people were already starting to die in it. Overwhelmingly, they were elderly, people who already had heart and lung disease. But because they were already seen as vulnerable, not unlikely to die in any harsh December, nobody panicked.
Before the Great Smog struck, around 300 people a day were dying in London, the normal mortality rate for December. But that Friday, the number of deaths jumped to 400. So while the disaster had only just begun, the smog had already killed 100 Londoners. And many thousands more had headed to bed, where they lay, pale, struggling for breath, slowly suffocating. On Saturday morning, after a bitterly cold night, Londoners woke to find smog still blanketing the city. Normally, they'd be heading Christmas shopping or to the football, but many were too ill.
It was the morning that my father started really to deteriorate, and he was wheezing. My father's getting worse and worse and worse. You just couldn't stop the fog percolating. There was no respite. There was nothing you could do.
To keep warm overnight, many Londoners had banked up their fires. This kept them smouldering all night, but gave off huge amounts of smoke. And many used a cheap coal called nutty slack.
While most coal was still rationed, the government had recently made the decision to allow nutty slack to be sold freely off ration. This is an advert from the Coal Board announcing this decision and proclaiming that it will help to keep the home fires burning however cold and long the winter. But look at this. Nutty slack is offered at 20 shillings a tonne cheaper than ordinary house coal because it's not as clean and it's smaller. In reality, what this meant is that this low-quality coal gave off much more noxious fumes and smoke. And Churchill's government was actively encouraging people to burn this particularly dirty, smoky coal.
And even the rationed coal being burned was low quality and full of impurities, because the government was exporting high-quality coal to help pay off Britain's war debt.
What was this low-quality coal, and what role did it play in the 1952 smog disaster? Well, Raksha's gone to find out.
I've come to the Forest of Dean. It's home to some of the only coal mines still operating in Britain today.
The mines here are operated by free miners, locals who, under an ancient covenant, are allowed to extract the coal.
Rich Daniels has mined here for much of his life.
Okay.
Right, let's go.
Here we are at the coal face. Not many people see a coal in this state underground. This is what it looks like before it's mined.
Do you get different qualities of coal? Because in 1952 in London, people were burning coal that was quite dirty and impure.
You get the highest grade coal, which is the anthracite coal, that burns pretty clean. Then it goes right to lignite, which is like a brown coal. And that's lots of impurities in it. That's what they would have been burning in London at the time.
That's more smoky?
It's more smoky, more impurities.
And people would have just been burning that all day, I presume?
All day and all night. Of course, it's important to understand it wasn't only the quality of the coal, it was the size. This is what they wanted for steam engines, in bigger blocks to generate power. This sort of size would have been for household use. And then this is a byproduct of producing that lump coal.
This is just like waste, though, isn't it? Is this what they were calling nutty slack, then?
Exactly.
Well, you can see, can't you? You've got these like, little nut-shaped bits of coal, but the rest of it is just dust.
It's just dust. That's why it smoulders and produces a lot of smoke. For the mining industry, this is more or less a waste product, so they could produce millions of tons of this.
It's no wonder, is it, that the Great Smog happened. They were burning this.
For a day and a half, the low-quality coal being burned in London had been making the smog ever more poisonous. While short spells of smog were quite common, the exceptional weather was making this one unusually prolonged and polluted. All Londoners could do was hope it would soon be over. On the second day of the Great Smog, London was grinding to a halt. People who tried to head out were often forced back by the choking stench. Sporting fixtures were cancelled, including a university football match at Wembley. The first match to be cancelled since the stadium was built in 1923. One event did go ahead, a cross-country race in the suburbs at Richmond. The smog there was thinner, but many runners still got lost. Though for some, the smog offered an opportunity.
I was in the South Kensington area, in the van, driving the van with PCs helping me, and we heard this smashing of glass. Straight away, we guessed the smash and grab, but because of the smog, it was difficult to tell what direction it came from. We were searching for probably a good hour till we found all the glass on the pavement, but obviously it was too late. The villains had gone. 2 television sets were taken out of the shop window.
Reports of the smog in the newspapers concentrated on the supposed crime wave it had caused, rather than its impact on health.
But still no one realised that this would become a mass killer. That did start to change with some alarming developments at the famous Great Smithfield Show. The prize cattle competing, animals in prime health, started to collapse.
Hundreds of animals had arrived ready for the show's opening.
I've come to Mudchute City Farm to meet vet Lauren Hammond, who's researched the consequences of the smog at the show.
I understand that cattle were falling ill during the Smithfield show. Can you tell me what was happening?
The cattle were starting to show signs of severe acute respiratory distress. They were open mouth breathing with their tongues hanging out. They really would have been struggling to breathe and suffocating.
Did the farmers offer any treatments to relieve their symptoms?
The farmers were quite ingenious. They'd taken the feed sack, they'd put some grain in it, and they'd soaked this in whiskey and placed it over the whole head of the cow. It was their equivalent of us trying to sniff some eucalyptus oil when we have a bad head cold.
Did any cattle die during the Great Smog?
Very sadly, there was one prize Angus bull who lost his life at the show. Then there were a further 12 animals that were put down, knowing that they would not recover. So that was 13 in total that died as a result of the Great Smog. There were a further 60 animals that required veterinary treatment.
I mean, that must have been quite shocking to the farmers to turn up to a fair, all of your cattle are healthy, and then all of a sudden they're dropping dead.
Absolutely. They would have been the farmers' pride and joy, they would have been their prize stock. So this would have been a very tragic event.
The widely reported death of these healthy cattle should have been a warning that this smog was unusually poisonous. But Churchill's government still failed to react, even as a human tragedy began to spiral across London.
Londoners, mostly in working class neighbourhoods, had started to notice that even by lunchtime, some of their neighbours hadn't brought in their milk. They'd started to miss appointments, and the police were receiving unusually high numbers of missing persons reports.
Police surgeon Dr. Geoffrey Roberts reports receiving a large number of calls from the police who'd been forced to break into the houses of these missing people. At one house, he found 64-year-old Arthur Payson. He'd been gassed in the First World War, and the previous day had complained about the foggy weather. Dr. Roberts found him dead in his bed. At another house was Beatrice Weller, who'd been suffering from a bad chest. The doctor arrived to find she'd had a heart attack. He called an ambulance, but it took an hour and a half to arrive. By then, it was too late. In a third house, he discovered 62-year-old widow Jane Ogden sitting upright, dead in an armchair.
Stories like these were being reported all over London. Thousands of people were falling sick, and deaths would continue to spiral as long as the smog lasted, and there was no end in sight.
My mother came in and said, well, you know, your father's very, very ill. He can't breathe, and this wheezing sound from the chest. You know, it was frightening, really. And then he went into delirium, and he started raving about politicians and political speeches because he worked at the House of Commons. And my mother was so worried about it. She had to brave the fog and go and find a phone box and ring the doctor. And he came round, and my father didn't even know he was there. And he said, I'll be back. That's all he said, and off he went. Meanwhile, my father was getting more and more delirious. I really didn't think he was going to last the night.
At 4:30 p.m. on the second day of the smog, the pollution levels were again taken here at City Hall. And shockingly, they had now increased even further.
Smoke levels were now 7 times higher than normal. Sulfur dioxide had also risen again and was 6 times higher. Both terribly dangerous levels, 12 times the limit allowed by today's regulations. That evening, most Londoners sensibly stayed at home, sealing themselves in, hoping by morning the smog would be gone. But it was already too late for many. That day, the mortality rate in London was twice the normal, and 280 deaths could be blamed on the smog. In just 2 days, it had already killed almost 400 people.
Hundreds with severe breathing difficulties were arriving in ambulances at hospitals across London. Respiratory wards were full, so patients were being put in any available bed.
But the authorities felt this was just another smog, which rarely lasted more than a couple of days.
But this wasn't an ordinary smog. The weather system, which was trapping all that smoke and pollution and poison, was directly above the capital, and it wasn't moving away. Until the weather changed, the smog would continue, and it would become ever more noxious and deadly. A disaster greater than anyone could have imagined was upon the people of London.
Next time, we explore how the smog became more deadly.
Thinking about the insides of my throat and lungs if I was exposed to that. I mean, that's pretty shocking, isn't it?
And how it began to affect increasing numbers of people.
All those are deaths that shouldn't have occurred.
Yeah, that's right. They're real people.
Discover how London finally breathed again.
Within a few hours, the smog just disappears. Must have been sweet relief for those people.
It was gorgeous. We took off our masks and said, well, that's that.
And uncover the shocking true scale of the disaster.
These are lives cut short by decades because of the smog.